All right. So we're going to get into our outline of what we'll be covering today. We're going to start with a bit of facts and statistics about depression, get into a little bit more about brain physiology, myths, and recognizing signs and symptoms. We'll go into more about some of the causes or the etiology of depression. We're going to talk a little bit about disparities in stigma, maladaptive coping strategies, and then we'll get into the practical strategies for working with our youth and our students. And I do want to mention that this presentation is, I tried to incorporate some baseline information about depression for individuals who might be a little bit less familiar with it. So there's some of that basic knowledge and then a little bit more of that extra in depth. But I realize that it's kind of tough sometimes to make a presentation that is at everyone's level. So I definitely encourage you to post questions in the chat if you need anything clarified or want to go more in depth about something that I talk about. So to begin, I always think it's really nice to start off with a mindfulness practice, since this is something that we do a lot of in the school. And I also recognize we're going through a lot of strange and challenging times right now that might be affecting us in different ways. So to begin, I thought it might be nice for us to do a bit of a mindfulness practice together. So what I'll ask, and I'll walk us through it, but what I'll ask is that everybody sit up with their back straight. Feel free to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. If that's not comfortable for you, don't worry about it. And I'll walk us through this mindfulness practice called Mindful Seat. So we often might find our thoughts are racing back towards the past and forward towards the future. We might get overwhelmed by our emotions or be distracted by our perceptions and sensations. So when we're sitting in our upright posture, I want us to take a couple of deep breaths in just to get us acquainted with the space that we're in right now. And we're first going to check in with our bodies. When you check in with your body, take notice of any sensations that you're noticing in your body. Just take notice of what might be happening in different parts of your body. Does something feel relaxed? Does something feel tense? Taking some deep breaths and just noticing. And when you're ready, move your attention towards your emotions. What emotions are present for you right now in this moment? Just taking notice of what you might be feeling right now, maybe what you've felt throughout the day and how that's changed. And when you're ready, move your attention towards your actions. Do you have any urges? What do you feel like doing in this moment? Maybe you feel like sitting up and putting your feet on the couch. Maybe you feel like going for a run. Just taking notice of any impulses that you feel like you might have right now. Just noticing. And then when you're ready, moving to your thoughts. What thoughts are present in this moment for you right now? Are you thinking about the fact that you might be hungry? Are you thinking about a deadline that you might have at work? Just noticing what thoughts are passing through your mind right now. And if you feel like there's anything that you'd like to go back to take extra notice of or pay extra attention to, feel free to, and taking a couple deep breaths whenever you're ready, coming back to the space, feeling like you can open your eyes if your eyes are closed, and feeling like you can put your camera on if you would like to do that. Thank you so much for starting that with me. And if anyone had any reactions to doing this mindfulness practice, I'd love to hear about it in the chat. So let's get started with some facts and statistics about depression. I am mostly going to read off of this, but just take notice if anything's jumping out to you. So some of the facts around depression is that 20% of our teenagers do experience some kind of depression before adulthood. It is one of the most common medical illnesses at this point. And 10 to 15% of our teens will struggle with symptoms of depression at any given point in time. So it might happen maybe at one point when they're 12, but they might be able to work on it. 5% will suffer from major depressive disorder. So that's about roughly 1 in 20 of our teenagers. Females also experience depression at higher rates during and after adolescence. So when we're thinking about our middle schoolers, we will take notice that often females will experience depression at higher rates. I'm just going to pause for a second. I think that somebody might have their mic not muted. If you could look at the bottom left of your screen and mute your mic, that would be great to prevent any background noise. Okay. Able to mute it. Okay. Suicide, unfortunately, is one of the most serious risks that are associated with depression. It is unfortunately the third leading cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds at this point in time. An episode of untreated depression lasts approximately 7 to 9 months. And so that is usually our entire school year for students. So it's important to take note of that. And 2/3 might struggle with other types of mental health illnesses. So often depression co-occurs with other mental health concerns such as anxiety or oppositional defiance disorder, some of more of that irritability and talking back, which we'll get into a little more. So I want to give a bit of background context about what the depressed brain looks like, and to help us understand and put into context what is actually happening in our brains when we're feeling depressed or we're going through a depressive episode. So we've got in green the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that is responsible for regulating our emotions, helping us make decisions, and helping us reason through situations. So this is our thinking part of the brain. Then we've got our amygdala in red, which is the part of the brain that's responsible for our emotions and our emotional behavior. So our fear responses, our startle responses, and the myriad of emotions that we might feel. And then we've got the hippocampus there in blue, which is responsible for our memory and our learning. And I'm also going to talk about cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So when the body produces an excess amount of cortisol, the prefrontal cortex appears almost to shrink, and that really will impact our ability to make decisions or regulate our emotions when it comes to depression. So we might engage in more impulsive-like behavior or indecisiveness. The prefrontal cortex tends to become really underactive when there's a lot of cortisol, stress hormone, and the amygdala, which is that emotional part, becomes really overactive. And when we have an overactive amygdala and an underactive prefrontal cortex, that can make it really impossible to think one's way out of depression. They're really just sitting in those feelings or those emotions. And then to just touch on the hippocampus briefly, as we get into more some of the signs and the symptoms of depression, we'll take notice of difficulties with concentration, memory, and learning. And the hippocampus is our part of our brain that is mostly responsible for those functions. So when we're secreting, again, a lot of that stress hormone of cortisol, it ends up dampening that learning and memory function for us in the hippocampus. So the next part of the presentation that I wanted to get into is some of the myths versus facts about depression. I have about 4 that we can go through. And again, I encourage you, if there's any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I can take a look at them after we go through the myths. But one of the first myths associated with depression is, my child is just lazy, they need to try harder. The fact around this is that depression can affect motivation levels. It can affect energy levels, sleep, and enjoyment of activities and tasks. So, what might look like a laziness might really just be a difficulty with motivation, a difficulty getting out of bed, for example, or doing the everyday activities that your child once might have been able to do without pause. So, brushing one's teeth, putting makeup on, getting themselves ready for school. You might notice that that looks like a laziness, but it really might just be that heaviness that comes often along with depression. The second myth around depression is this is just a phase. Everyone feels this way sometimes. The fact around this is that sadness is absolutely normal, but untreated depression, as I mentioned earlier, can last 7 to 9 months. And it can really be associated with some maladaptive or unhealthy outcomes, which we'll get into more. But some examples are poor grades or substance abuse, reckless behavior, difficulty with relationships. So if it is a sadness, it's fairly normal. We all as humans have so many different emotions that we cycle throughout the day. Our emotional states don't necessarily stay the same throughout the day. So if it's a sadness, those feelings and moods do tend to pass relatively quickly. Depression is really pervasive. You'll notice it over a length of 2 weeks plus, and it will really affect your teens abilities to engage in their everyday activities. So we're really looking for that change. The next myth is my teen just has a bad attitude and they're irritable. The fact around this is that in teens, again, it's important to find out about changes. We really want to look at how does my teen typically function? What activities are they typically enjoying? Who do they typically spend their time with? And has that changed? I also want to mention that adolescence is really that time period for asserting autonomy, where teens tend to get a little bit more rebellious, or they might be talking back more as they work through who they are in this world. We might see more of a reliance on spending time with peers as opposed to spending time with family at home. So sometimes it's really about discerning, is this typical teenage bad attitude? Or is this really and truly a change from how my teen typically functions? The last myth that I wanted to go through is my teen has everything. They're smart and they have supportive friends and parents. The fact around this is that depression can run in families and it does have a strong genetic component, as well as anxiety. And social supports can actually be incredibly protective. So, having supportive friends and supportive parents, supportive school staff can really help protect and help the teen work through some of these depression difficulties. Depression can also be triggered by a stressful life event, and we will get into a little bit more about the causes of depression. So, keeping in mind that although it might look like your teen has access possibly to lots of different opportunities, there might be a stressful life event or something that happens that the teen might actually be feeling depressed about. So, again, I just want to reiterate, it's really about looking for those changes. So, in terms of recognizing teen depression, I put a few points up here. I'll read them out loud, but feel free to also scan them on your own too. Really just trying as parents and educators or therapists, school staff, whoever you are tonight and whatever relationship you have with the students, helping you recognize a little bit more about what teen depression might look like. So we're really seeing the sadness, the hopelessness, irritability, and anger. So I also want to say the ones that I've made in red are the ones that are often noted in teenagers or younger kids. So instead of seeing as much sadness and hopelessness, we might see more irritability and anger from a younger child or a teenager. There's often tearfulness, and we're really looking for changes in eating habits, eating emotions, for example, or not eating much at all, changes in sleeping habits. So, again, there's that extreme, either sleeping a lot or not sleeping much at all. Loss of interest in activities that they were once enjoying is a really big thing to make note of. Difficulty with concentration. So is it taking your teen longer to read a book for school, for example, than it normally would? And maybe your teen generally does read slower. So really, again, looking for those changes. Drops in grades, change in relationships, and engagement in those relationships. Were they once talking to friends and not talking to friends at all anymore? Lack of energy and fatigue. It's often described as the body feeling really heavy. And you can kind of see this almost just a shoulder hunched like appearance sometimes. Then there's the unexplained aches and pains. So I know that we're not in person at school right now, but taking notice at home too. Is your child or teen complaining about belly aches often, headaches often, but that there's not necessarily a medical cause around that? So taking notice of that, it can express itself that way too. Withdrawal, restlessness, agitation, feelings of worthlessness, just not feeling really good about themselves, being really sensitive to criticism or perceived criticism and feedback. And then also thoughts of death. So taking notice if your child is saying things like, I just wish that I were gone, I wish that I were dead. Really bringing that up with a trusted family member or therapist, but just taking notice of that. So what might be causing depression in my teen? There are a few that we'll go through. The first one here is trauma, and this can refer to the stressful life events that I alluded to a couple slides ago. It can be experienced once, and it can be ongoing. The child might not have directly experienced trauma either, but they might be witness to the trauma or hear about the trauma, and that can also be traumatizing. Unfortunately, there are many different kinds and types of trauma that a kid or a teen can experience, ranging from physical abuse or emotional abuse, neglect, things like being witness to community violence or a violent act. Family stress can be traumatic depending on the child. Witness to family violence, or disruption in attachment or a caregiving experience. So, for example, the passing of a loved one or a divorce. Natural disasters as well. Then we've got genetics. Again, there's a large biological component. I can't remember the exact percentage right now, which I should know. But often depression does run in families along with other types of mood difficulties such as anxiety. And then we've got bullying. So social exclusion, and this can be emotional, it can be physical, and it also can be cyberbullying. That is on the rise now with increased use of social media, especially in this pandemic. And this can really affect how good our children feel about themselves. So in person, when your child is going to school in person, again, just looking out for that somatization that I was talking about, increase in stomach aches and headaches, physical illnesses, not wanting to go to school, for example, school absences, just taking notice of some of those. Then we've got stress and pressure. I know that right now there might be a little bit more of a slower pace dependent on each of your family's situations. I don't want to make assumptions, but generally our society is really moving at a fast and quick pace, and we're kind of expecting these super functional teenagers. We often expect our teenagers to be involved in various different activities, from sports, but also achieving good enough standards in our minds in terms of academics. And often that's described by the teenagers as just being purely exhausting, and it can be hard to know where to let go of certain activities. And often our culture will push that striving culture. So just taking notice of what kinds of pressures or stresses is your teenager facing, what might be contributing to that. Social media, as I touched on before, and I know that my supervisor gave a really comprehensive presentation about social media for anyone who might be interested, but this can be a huge source of anxiety and depression and pressure for adolescents. So comparing themselves, for example, favorably or unfavorably to anyone they might follow on social media, and also the increase of cyberbullying. Then we've got relationships. So often, as I mentioned before, teenagers are at this place in their development where they're trying to move a little bit more away from the family and more towards their peer relationships. And these can be incredibly fulfilling, but they can also be really challenging as the teens navigating who they are as a person and navigating through some of their own identities and the relationship with themselves. They often might experience their first romantic relationships, which again can be really fulfilling, but also a source of stress as they navigate who they are. And then we've got systemic barriers, which I'll touch into more on the next slide. This is really that interaction of different types of marginalization or oppression in our system. So living in a low income neighborhood, having access to resources and nutrition, family composition, racial inequality, systems of privilege and oppression, or sexual orientation identity. So let's get into that a little bit more. In terms of disparities and stigma involving depression, there are quite a few, but I wanted to highlight three different ones. So we've got gender roles and identity here. So it might not often, as I mentioned before, women and younger girls are getting diagnosed at higher rates with depression than our teenage boys and are men in society. So it might not actually be that a greater number of girls or women are depressed, but it might be more that a woman is more likely to receive a diagnosis. So when we think about socialization, the understanding that people who do identify as women are often socialized to be more nurturing, caring, express their emotions, whereas people who identify as boys or men might be socialized more often to push their emotions down. And I also want to mention that this is not true for everybody, dependent on what gender they are. These are just broad generalizations again. So there are definitely women who push their emotions down, and there are definitely men who express their emotions more. So again, these are just broad socialization observations. But often what happens when individuals, especially men, might be pushing their emotions down is that they might take these emotions out in other ways. So instead of it getting expressed so much as a depression or a sadness or a hurt, it might look more like anger. It might come out more as an angry explosion or substance abuse or more of that reckless sensationalizing behavior, as opposed to a woman who might be socialized more to express her feelings through crying or more of those typical types of depression symptoms that we discussed a couple slides ago. And then we've got the LGBTQ plus identities. Often there's a higher vulnerability to depression in these populations. And there is usually a lack of equitable access to mental health care, unfortunately. There might be social stigma associated, or just sort of feeling invisible in places that don't necessarily take into account around providers who don't necessarily take into account sexual orientation or transgender identities. So again, there might be a lack of knowledge of providers, and that can really compound feelings of depression to not feel understood by your provider. And then we've got race. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for African American youth. I am going to focus in a little bit more on this, but suicide risk for Black boys between the ages of 5 and 11 is 2 to 3 times higher than that of white boys. And the American Psychological Association report discusses often how society will view Black boys as more likely to be viewed as older, less innocent, more responsible or culpable than others for their behavior. And these are some biased beliefs that might lead to harsher interventions in school starting as early as pre-kindergarten. So for instance, Black boys are over 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than white students. And these disparities, combined with a lack of awareness about what depression might look like for men, as I spoke about in the gender roles, can really lead to social reprimand, school suspensions, and expulsion, and a lack of mental health care that will be needed. Young men of color are also more likely to be caught up in that school to prison pipeline as a result of these experiences. And people of color on a whole are more likely to be the target of microaggressions, which are those unconscious comments or actions that are incredibly harmful. So for example, an example of a microaggression would be for a teacher saying to a Mexican student, wow, you speak English really well. And let's say that Mexican student grew up their whole lives in Chicago. It's really these unconscious comments or actions that are really harmful. I also want us to focus in a little bit more on the intersection of identities, because it's really important when we look at gender and race together. So for example, Black female teenagers might experience that double jeopardy of discrimination, both on the basis of race and gender, and having that lead to depression or feeling invisible. So again, there's that lack of equitable access to mental health care. That I have a video on the next slide that will touch a lot more on some of these points and expand more on them too. So I'm just gonna stop the share and go over to the video for a second. And then we'll start the share again. Okay, so this is a video. Oh wait, I don't think I put the, oh, I did put the computer sound on. So you should be able to hear this video. If not, please unmute yourself and let me know. But this is a video about the stigmas and disparities that I was speaking a little bit more about in depth.
It's hard enough to get mental health treatment in the US, but it's even harder if you're not white. Studies show that racial and ethnic minorities are significantly less likely to receive mental health treatment than whites. So we reached out to experts to find out why it's so hard for people of color to get help. The first thing is stigma. In other words, shame or disgrace that can make people feel excluded. Stigma is a big deal in the US, but especially in communities of color.
The Asian American community has high amounts of depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses, just like every other community. Even when people might get connected to a healthcare provider, often the family doesn't understand. They feel like if it's known that their child is seeking help, that the family will be looked down upon.
Your cultural value, your cultural circle does not afford you the possibility of asking for help. Not being able to even verbalize that piece then leads people to very dark corners and very dark places. Depression, untreated depression in those cases oftentimes leads to suicidal ideation or drinking or substance use of some sort.
The second reason is a lack of cultural competence. Cultural competence is a doctor's ability to recognize the different places their patients are coming from and then be able to adapt to their needs.
Traditionally, African Americans will not come in and say, I'm depressed. They'll say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Fatigue is a real clear sign. So they'll not really even appreciate themselves that what they're experiencing is a mental disorder, because that's considered frailty. And frailty is something that's not really considered acceptable in a community that consists of mostly working people.
A person might be considered psychotic if they say they believe in ghosts. But this is a cultural belief. Sometimes it can rise to the level of a delusion, but sometimes it just has to be taken into account.
Not being sensitive to culture can lead to a wrong diagnosis, and that's happened. And it's led to a legacy of distrust. That distrust has included outright racism.
During times of slavery, African Americans, particularly African American women, were experimented upon in terms of OBGYN surgeries, and there's clear history of that. They were also subjected to an experiment called the Tuskegee experiment.
We're talking about a federally funded 40-year syphilis experiment that turned people into human lab rats without their knowledge. And by the way, that experiment didn't end until 1972. And for people who don't speak English, finding a therapist who speaks your language isn't easy.
On a national scale, the lack of mental health providers that speak other languages is large. Think about the areas of conflict right now, the Middle East. There's a lot of people coming from Syria. Who speaks Arabic fluently? When you think about people migrating from Africa, people from Ethiopia or Eritrea that are coming to the United States, there's, I don't know how many languages in India, not everybody speaks Hindi.
Finally, there's a lack of providers, and few mental health care providers of color, which could go a long way into tackling all the issues we just discussed. And while the Affordable Care Act has helped a lot of people gain access to treatment, who's filling all that demand? And if people have to wait for hours in line just to get treatment, which patients will fall through the cracks?
Okay, let me just pull the PowerPoint up again. All right. I know that that might be heavy and it's hard to hear about some of those things. So again, I just encourage if anyone has any questions or reactions, please feel free to post them in the chat. And I will definitely make sure to take a look and make sure to talk about them. So we are going to move on towards outcomes and coping strategies so we can get into some of the ways that we can work with our students. So some of these were talked about in the video just now and that I've already alluded to, but some of the outcomes or things that you'll notice are problems at school, running away, substance abuse, reckless behavior, violence, a smartphone addiction, again, taking notice of the change, self-injury, eating disorders or eating difficulties, and relationship difficulties. I know that we're running short on time, so I am going to skip over this video, but I'll send the link out. What can we do? So I wanted to dedicate a slide. I know that we just watched that video about stigma. Dedicate a slide to anti-oppressive and inclusive therapy care, just in case resources are needed. So I know that we can go through some of these, but Psychology Today is a wonderful website that you can go on to find providers who speak your language, or providers who are of a similar race or a certain race that you'd like to work with, for example. And then I've also pasted in here some helpful social media accounts along with the websites that I think have a lot of wonderful resources to address that intersectionality and healing. So Kindred Medicine is really great. There's a lot of Black, Indigenous, and people of color healers that work through Kindred Medicine, and it's sort of a database. You can go to the website there. Holistic Psychologist is another wonderful psychologist who looks at healing in a lot of different ways and therapy from a lot of different angles. So taking into account many different cultures. Then we've got therapy for Black girls. We've got a South Asian network. This list is not exhaustive. These were just some of the ones that I can vouch for and that have been helpful. And I'm still always on the search for more to add to this list. Then there's teletherapy from Black providers. And then our Clinic DePaul Family and Community Services in Lincoln Park is also a wonderful clinic that tries its best to tackle oppression and operate from an anti-oppressive lens. So you can always reach out to myself through that email or my supervisor, Dr. Orson Morrison, if you'd like more information about that. And the last website there is really wonderful. This is an initiative that is recently started in the past year or two. And at healthconnectionhub.org, you can type in your zip code and find resources that are close to where you live, not only for mental health, but also for different types of needs like housing needs, education, nutrition. And I think it's such a wonderful resource to put up there for anyone to have. So let's get into some of our strategies. And I do want to disclaim that some of these might feel basic, but it's also important to kind of go back to the basics sometimes when we're talking about depression. So the first one's listening. So really focus on listening to your student or your teen at home and resisting that urge to criticize or pass judgment or jump in. Trying to create a safe space for your teen to let them know that you're there for them unconditionally. And another important thing is to pay attention to nonverbal communication, that even if your child's not necessarily saying something, what is their body saying to you? What are their facial expressions saying to you? Acknowledging their feelings or validation is also really important. And even if their concerns or feelings kind of feel silly or irrational to you, not something you would necessarily worry about, just validating that for your teen if that's something that's making them really sad. So saying things like, that sounds really difficult. I'm really sorry to hear that you're going through that. It sounds like a painful experience for you. Sometimes just acknowledging that pain and sadness can really go a long way in making your teen feel supported and understood. Then we have modeling reactions, emotion language, and behavior. So showing a child how to appropriately react when something doesn't go well. Using emotion language within the household, using I feel statements. So for example, let's say you were late to work one day and you were feeling really frustrated about that. Modeling for your child, oh, I felt really frustrated today when I was late for work. And that can help to normalize emotions too, and showing your child like, hey, even though I'm an adult or I'm a teacher, I'm a parent, I also have different feelings as well. Initiating communication and conversation. So often parents might have a fear that talking about depression or suicide might only increase that risk. But if your child is already thinking about it, by talking about it, you're not increasing the risk. You're really giving them a space to feel heard and feel safe. Sometimes self injury behavior might be a cry for help and a cry for that nurturance. So you're letting them know that they matter, often by initiating that conversation or pointing out what you might have noticed. And it can really help reduce that stigma that we were talking about around mental health illnesses. Strategy number 2 is really encouraging social connection. I know that that might be very hard to do right now in person, given the situation that we're in. But depressed teens do tend to withdraw more from their friends and activities. So it might be about getting creative with that quality time right now. Making FaceTime a priority if you're a parent, setting aside time each day to talk or check in. Maybe it's a walk around the block or sitting together later on at night or something like that without distractions. Really just connecting face to face, checking in. It doesn't need to be for half an hour. Maybe it's just for 5 minutes or so. Maybe it's doing an activity together. It's also really helpful to encourage time with friends or other healthy social supports. And again, right now, I recognize the limitations in that. So it might be about getting creative with Zoom meetings, FaceTime hangouts, social distancing hangouts, but just helping your child activate that participation with their social support system. Similar for the next point, involvement in activities or hobbies. Again, there's limitations around that right now, but encouraging some of that at home too. Maybe encouraging your child to try something new that they might have been interested in for a long time, or getting back into something that they once were really interested in, and creating and carving out time for that. And maybe that's something that you'd like to do with them together, or parts of it together. Mentorship and volunteerism can also be incredibly helpful, especially for individuals from lower economic areas. Really just having that responsibility to make their communities a better place. Again, there are limitations around this right now, but an example that I can think of would be in school, assigning a student a particular task or role to help promote that sense of responsibility or volunteerism. Then we've got strategy 3, which is prioritizing physical health. Physical and mental health are just inextricably connected. Often, when our minds are in different places or unhealthy places, we are feeling that somewhere in our bodies, even if we're not necessarily aware of it. So often what happens with depression, as I mentioned before, it's that sense of heaviness and that feeling of heaviness. So getting your teen up and moving can be incredibly helpful, and especially teenagers are not always known for their healthier habits. They might be staying up late, trying to sneak some extra screen time, eating unhealthier food, but really just getting them up and moving as best as possible. So if it's feasible, having them go on a walk around the block. It might be really thinking outside of the box right now. Again, walking the dog, dance parties in the house, shooting basketball on the driveway if that's something that's feasible. Getting outside and just sitting in the sun. Something that has also been really helpful for e-learning is just encouraging your teen to get up out of their chair ever so often and stretch. A lot of us are sitting at our desks 24/7 right now, and same with our teens. So really just encouraging just some simple stretching that you can do with them too. Setting limits on screen time is also important, even though teens might try to defy that or talk back about that. But structure is incredibly important. When screen time goes up, physical activity and FaceTime with friends generally will go down. Nutrition, again, trying your best to provide those balanced meals. And I do recognize, again, that's not always feasible. And that's also why I encourage, if you need to, visiting that website, healthconnectionhub.org, if there are some nutrition difficulties or there's not always adequate access to nutrition. And then sleep routine's also important. So trying your best to the best of your ability. I know that teens don't always listen, but trying your best to enforce a sleep routine, especially since teens are often home all the time right now. So the main takeaways here is that predictability is important. So homework routines, where is the student doing homework, sleep routines, eating routines, that can really help to regulate both that physical and mental health. And then we've got strategy 4, which is seeking that professional help. School-based resources are really effective, especially for individuals from lower income families or underinsured families, really addressing those systemic barriers that I spoke about earlier. I also recognize that we're not in school right now, so that is definitely not accessible at this point in time. But when you're thinking about seeking out professional help, it's really important to involve your middle schooler or your child, your teenager in that decision. Recognizing that no one therapist or anyone who works with your teen will necessarily be a miracle worker, but it's so important for your teen to have a say and to feel comfortable with who they're working with, especially when we're considering culturally competent care. It can be helpful if the teen is willing to have parental involvement in the treatment to help reinforce anything that the teen might be gravitating towards or learning. Again, I include the healthconnectionhub.org website to look up any community services or areas of need in terms of seeking professional involvement or help. And a great first step can also be speaking to your pediatrician about it. So some of our last strategies are strategy 5, which is really slowing things down. Really, that's where the mindfulness piece comes in. So it's about paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. So oftentimes, depression has individuals kind of stuck in the past, stuck in something that could have happened, kind of dwelling in that place in the past. So helping your child develop a non-judgmental attitude. So really nurturing that kindness and compassion towards themselves, that, it's okay for me to feel this way, really helping them understand that we do have a range of emotions, and sometimes we are going to struggle more with those emotions than at other times. Setting an intention around mindfulness, and I'll share some strategies on the next slide, and expanding awareness and paying attention. So it's really about paying attention to that present moment. What can ground me here in this present moment? Here are some mindfulness strategies that I thought would be helpful specifically for depression. And as I alluded to before, It might be about picking activities and hobbies intentionally. If our students and our teens are facing a lot of that social and academic pressure, is there a place where they can pick or select intentionally an activity that they would like to do? Deep breathing can work wonders. Becoming aware of that breath, what it feels like when you breathe in, what it feels like when you breathe out. Can you send that breath to other parts of your body? There's apps that I've included on the next slide that are incredibly helpful. They're guided. You can engage in breathing for 3 minutes. You can do it for 10 minutes. And I think those are a really nice starting place for a lot of teens who are wanting to get more aware of their breath or just have an outlet if they're feeling stressed out. Then we've got body scans. That's also part of those mindfulness apps. And that's really just a little bit of what we did at the beginning of this presentation. Just checking in with the different parts of your body, from feet to knees to hips to arms, shoulders, just scanning your way up your body and taking notice of any sensations you might be feeling. Visualization of a safe space, often eyes open or eyes closed, depending on what's comfortable, but really using all of your senses to engage in a safe place. What does it look like? What does it sound like in my safe place in my mind? What can I feel around me? What can I smell? What can I taste? And that brings me into grounding strategies, again, using those five senses. So sometimes, for example, when I'm feeling stressed or sad, I might just ground myself where I am in my moment. And that's as simple as looking around the room and being like, well, what can I tangibly see right now? What can I hear right now? What am I touching right now? It's really impossible to do grounding strategies and not be mindful because you are forced to pay attention to that present moment. And then we've also got gratitude practices, and that's a nice thing that can be done with a parent or even with a teacher in a classroom together. Just thinking about one or two things every day that you do hold gratitude for, even if things have felt bad. Is there one or two things or people that has been okay? It doesn't even have to be good, but has it been okay for the day? These are some mindfulness apps that are incredibly helpful. I know a lot of students really like Calm and use it before bed. You can add in nature sounds, and there's beautiful backdrops and screens with sunsets or forests, whatever might be the most comfortable. And then we've got Liberate. Liberate's really wonderful, especially for individuals who are looking to work with or listen to mindfulness meditations by people who belong to the same ethnicities or races to help build that inclusion. And then we've got Stop, Breathe, Think, which is one of my favorites because there's a ton of those guided breathing exercises or body scans as well that are for specific times. So I know we're reaching the end, and I was going to do a gratefulness practice or a gratitude practice, but I also want to be respectful of time and leave some time for any questions if there are any. So I will go over to the last slide here. I've included my contact information here, which you'll get with a copy of the presentation likely tomorrow. And if you could please fill out this short survey to provide any feedback to myself or my supervisor to help us plan these presentations and workshops more, that would be incredible to go to the link down at the bottom there. And I'll leave that up for a second, but I know that we're a relatively small group. So if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. I would love to hear any questions or comments.
DePaul University.
Mm-hmm.
just out of curiosity because of the name, is it a faith-based university or is it a?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is a faith-based university, but you don't need to be faith-based to work there or attend there. And our clinic also operates sort of like, even though we're entrenched at DePaul, we also operate separately, and we're not tied to any particular faith. But that's a great question.
I like it.
But yeah, I will stay on for a couple extra minutes because I also realized that I presented a ton of information and it might need some time for integration. So if I'll stay on for about 5 or so extra minutes for anyone who has to get going, feel free to sign off. I really appreciate all of you attending tonight. And if there are any other questions that pop into your mind over the next couple of days, please reach out over email. I am definitely here to answer questions or collaborate with you. And yeah, I'll stop the share, but I'll stay on for a little while. Thank you so much for attending tonight.
Since we attended this session, this meeting today, will you be sending updates of future meetings or teachings? Because I enjoyed it very much.
I'm so glad. Yes, we will. I don't think we have anything else upcoming right now, but usually I'm wondering how you found out about this, because I can give that feedback to my supervisor too when we kind of promote the talks a little bit more.
I'm thinking that I got it from my the source from my job. I work for MHMR of Tarrant County in Texas. And I don't know if I got it from there or if I got it from, I don't think I received it from my supervision because we haven't started yet. We just started actually today. And I have this set up already since last week or the week before. I can't remember from where. I wish I knew, but I think it's very informative, very, how do you say, I'm sorry, I just want, very professional. I think that information is valid. I see some of the visitors that are there, and I have done some, I have received some teachings from the organizations that are there that I see. And I think that this is a benefit for me, for my profession, which I'm, that I'm going to embark on. And I like it that you gave a clear explanation. I loved it. I really did. And I could compare it with other information and see that it's true. And then the recommendations that you gave are sites and recommendations that are valid. And that's what I like. The value, the valid, the validity of the information that you provide and the sources that you provide too. So thank you very much.
No problem. I'm so glad. I'm really grateful that this was helpful, and I appreciate you attending so much. And I know that my supervisor, if you're on that Eventbrite email list, again, you'll be getting that copy of the presentation PDF and a recording. And oh, I can go ahead and stop this recording.